Hello everyone, today we talk about the US Civil War. As you know, from last year I started a mini-series of, I don't remember how many chapters I planned. I have everything already pre-packed for the next episodes. That is aimed at starting properly the discourse on the US Civil War, mostly from a military historical point of view. Right, and naturally, I plan to make really hundreds and hundreds of videos, right, considering the current rhythm about the US Civil War. Of course, we cover so many other topics, so that at large, it's rare to find something that we really cover very frequently. There is all, at this point, multiple cycles entwining, overlapping, doing very interesting things. I don't reveal the mechanism behind the videos. However, everything is going exactly the way it should. 19th century warfare is very important for a great number of reasons, and the US Civil War is quite didactic in this case. There is really a lot into it, so the series aims to provide sort of the basic info, but also sort of the macroscopic conceptualization of certain bigger scale aspects that, as you know, is a bit the philosophy of Schwerpunkt. It's important to look at the bigger picture, not necessarily first, but also next to the details. We get, of course, in the technical, the quantitative, and especially today's topic lends itself very much to the systemic, but also sort of more specific approach, because it deals with the strategic imbalance at the outset of the Civil War. The series does not, it does have some, along the way, some chronological frame and sort of development. However, it mostly goes by themes to, again, frame better the whole picture for the more in-depth campaign, battle videos, etc. videos. Now, when the American Civil War began, as we've already seen by when the Union entered the conflict with a total population of 22.1 million free citizens plus 344,000 freed blacks, while the Confederacy had only 5 million white inhabitants, 3.5 million enslaved African Americans, and 133,000 free blacks. You understand, here we're making a big comparison, just in scale, quantitatively, also in quality, as we'll see now, but giving a bit of an idea of how, at least from a strictly strategical point of view, the myth of the lost cause that is, say, mostly debated in a moralistic sense exposed, but I'm talking here in more Clausewitzian terms, and this is valid for all the wars that we cover, from the Bronze Age to Ukraine. A war is fought as long as there is also some sensible realization that it can't be won, and or in fact the outcome, it cannot be determined. So the notion that actually the Confederacy went at war just because of the ideal, not expecting to win, is of course wrong, and it also sort of takes away that level of merit and quality from a military point of view that the Confederates did have, as you know, in a also qualitative sense. And it also dismantles a bit the notion that, again, it's just about industry, money, power, which is also a bit like the big conspiracy theory about the whole thing, right? Things, if you know the American Civil War in some detail, which I know like many of you do, given that you're not just passionate about military history, but you're also in great part from the United States yourself. That's a very substantial chunk, almost a half of my total viewers. I don't have to repeat, right? So it's also interesting probably for you to hear me talk about this kind of topics. Just recently I was sort of appreciated for other reasons in the Q&A regarding my insights on contemporary America, the issue also. Not much of slavery, we didn't talk about that, but say related topics too. So that's sort of another side of the story that is baked into the political wall, and naturally in part also in the whole social, military aspects. This numbers that we are just offered here are impressive, because if you look between the North and the South, we're going to make this big comparative video today between the Union and the Confederacy. The free population ratio was 22.5 million to 5.5 million. Exactly 4 to 1, the largest material numerical, say better, disparity in any civil war in the 19th century. The North could also draw on a much larger pool of military-age males, approximately 3.5 to 4 million versus roughly 1 million in the South. The North could lose 3 men for every Southern loss and still have more soldiers left than the Confederacy ever fielded, and possessed a regular army that, although tiny in 1861, provided a professional officer corps that remained overwhelmingly loyal to the Union. Of the roughly 1080 officers in the pre-war U.S. Army who graduated from West Point, only about 300 resigned to join the Confederacy. Actual number 296 defected. At least it seems one more, one less, but it's important the Union kept 754 West Point graduates and virtually the entire Corps of Engineers, giving the North crushing superiority in siege warfare and logistics, leaving the Union with the vast majority of trained staff and engineering officers in America. This aspect is striking already. By 1860, the industrial disparity, this in a broader economical sense, was overwhelming. Like the northern states, this was notorious, contained over 110,000 manufacturing plants compared to roughly 10,000 in the South, so 11 to 1, and produced 94% of all American steel and 97% of all firearms manufactured, at least in the country. Value of northern manufactured goods in 1860, something like $1 billion versus the South's 155 million. A 10 to 1 gap that became 20 to 1 by the war's end, that naturally, of course, had already witnessed like the odds tilting towards dramatically in favor of the Union. Northern foundries, such as the Tredegar Iron Works northern counterparts and the Springfield and Harper's Ferry armories, the latter captured early but soon replaced, gave the Union an almost inexhaustible supply of artillery and small arms, while the Confederacy relied heavily on battlefield capture, literally, like the Swiss army in the 15th century, and imports, of course, run through the blockade that was exercised, we'll talk about later. We discussed the Anaconda Plan already in other videos. I have an entire playlist dedicated to United States warfare, so we've seen not just the Civil War, but also how, since the War of Independence, the American military had essentially developed. By 1865, the Union had manufactured over 1.5 million rifled muskets at Springfield alone, plus hundreds of thousands more from private contractors, whereas the total Confederate domestic rifle production never exceeded 300,000 to 400,000. The Union's small arms output was something like almost 3 million. The Confederacy, domestic plus imports, never surpassed 700,000. Captured weapons made up to 30-40% of Confederate infantry rifles by 1864. Surprisingly, the North also outproduced the South agriculturally. I mean, it may not be surprising at all at this point, but of course industrialization is not everything at this point in history. The Union controlled 65% of the nation's farmed acreage, 60% of its livestock, 67% of its corn crop, and 80% of its wheat harvest. Right, so we're talking about a crushing superiority also in agricultural production. Union grain surplus fed its armies and still exported 50 million bushels abroad. The Confederacy faced bread riots by spring 1863 in order to supply the army and because of the blockade. In infrastructure, the gap was equally stark. The Union possessed more than 70% of the country's railroad mileage, approximately 22,000 miles versus 9,000 in the South, and 3 times the locomotives/rolling stock, as well as approximately 90% of its telegraph lines. This rail and telegraph network allowed the rapid concentration of troops and supplies that would prove, in relative terms, the tip of the balance in campaigns from Chattanooga to Petersburg. The U.S. Military Railroad, created in 1862, became the first large-scale government-operated railway in world history and moved entire armies hundreds of miles in days. Right? Remember that military organization requires political centralization. Right? In this case, for logistical reasons, but starting, in fact, this enormous enterprise, also in Europe, some countries witnessed the first solid sort of large-scale government established railway, and at that point, sort of also under the military control to the end of the war, only during World War I, right? And dramatically contributing to the modernization of those countries. In 1864 alone, this railway system transported 250,000 men and 50,000 horses in weeks, something the South could never replicate. And these statistics reveal a massive initial strategic imbalance. However, this superiority remained largely theoretical. Because, as we were saying before, and as also von Clausewitz well teaches, we'll come back on not just the Formkriege, but also some important Clausewitzian theoretical insight, not immediately translated in the military balance. Right? The North finally converted this advantage into decisive battlefield dominance only during, in fact, the war's final stage. And essentially, we're looking at the last year, the last 12 months. All right. All this material superiority does not immediately equate to a political superiority, and consequently a military one. If you conceptualize this, you're very much ahead in any kind of political and strategic thinking. The US Civil War shows dramatically how much the South could achieve and how it could actually win the war, given even this disparity. The total enlistments of the Union were 2.1 million. The Confederate enlistments never really surpassed. Here there is a debate. Some say that there were never more than 800,000 Confederates in arms. The enlistments, at least, seemingly were 900,000 to 1.1 million. What these numbers mean is that the North could replace losses, because naturally this quantity is cumulative. The South instead bled out, right? The Confederate strategy of defensive waiting is also a very important one, at least in particular during a specific time of the war. Other elements, in fact, were to prove ultimately far more important in shaping the war's strategy and the broader framework. The fundamental character of the contest placed, in fact, the burden of aggression squarely on the federal armies. And as we know very well, the offensive is the weaker form of war, but the one with the positive aim. In fact, in order to succeed, the offensive requires the best synergy of the Clausewitzian trinity, right? It must essentially measures the civilization of a people, politically, in the military, and in support of the people. The Union had to invade, conquer, and forcibly restore the seceded states that constituted a massive chunk of the whole. There was not a union anymore, at least from the southern side, whereas the Confederacy needed only to maintain a viable, mobile field army capable of reacting to Union moves and prolonging the fight until Northern public opinion, exhausted by casualties and economic hardship that, as we will see, was also notoriously felt in the North, compelled the Lincoln administration to accept Southern independence. This is kind of normal. A whole annihilation of the South in a broader sense was something impossible, and something that Lincoln himself worked not to fully achieve at the end of the war. This created the classic offensive-defensive paradox. The materially stronger side had to attack, while the weaker side could fight on the strategic defensive, an enormous early advantage for the Confederacy, given still the absolute scale of its power. So it doesn't matter how much material the North had, it also had to mobilize that. And this was much more complex and really momentously demanding than what the South had to do to prevail. This, we can say, almost Fabian or defensive-offensive approach had been explicitly outlined by Jefferson Davis and his military advisors and mirrored the successful strategy used by the same George Washington during the War of Independence. Confederate Secretary of War George Randolph formally articulated in 1862 that the South needed merely to, quote, hold its own until foreign recognition or northern exhaustion forced a negotiated peace. All right. The international situation is very fascinating. There is a level of isolation at this point in the United States, not like the American War of Independence. However, there were very important things happening abroad that we will, if anything, have to make a video on that had a great impact also on the U.S. Civil War. A critical early boost for the Union came from its ability to keep 4 key border slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, inside the same Union. This is also notorious. These were slave states. This was secured in part by swift federal occupation of strategic points and the declaration of martial law were necessary, most dramatically in Maryland after the Baltimore riots of April 1861 and the arrest of pro-secession legislators. This was a very clever and successful move. And also from the detachment of the strongly Unionist western counties of Virginia, which entered the Union as West Virginia, in fact, in 1863. These territories not only added substantial manpower and resources to the North. Kentucky alone contributed nearly 100,000 soldiers to the Union cause throughout the war, while Missouri supplied another 110,000. Together, the broader states provided more white troops to the Union than the entire Confederacy fielded at its peak, namely 300,000 white border state troops versus the Confederate peak strength of 460,000 at a time, troops in service in 1863, denying the South thus something from 35 to 40% more white manpower than the 11 seceded states alone possessed, but also dramatically altered the geography of the Eastern Theater, providing the Union with far greater strategic depth while simultaneously shortening and exposing the Confederacy's defensive frontier, which had been counted on before the war. The importance of this geographic advantage is clearly illustrated by Robert E. Lee's 2 audacious invasions across the Potomac into Maryland in 1862 and 1863, attempts to carry the war onto northern soil. Lee was a West Point graduate from 1829, second in his class, no demerits. He was a Mexican-American war hero, as many of the greatest generals of the U.S. Civil War. I made, again, a video also about the Mexican-American War. He was the former superintendent of West Point itself. He had himself notoriously been offered the Union Field Command by Lincoln for a reason, but resigned when Virginia seceded. Naturally, in front of the protagonists, we will make entire military biography videos because that's what they deserve. Lee commanded the Confederacy's premier field army, the Army of Northern Virginia. The 1862 Maryland campaign, the Antietam one, was launched partly to harvest Maryland crops because of the aforementioned sort of material shortages of the South, among the other things. Also, of course, influencing at that point the northern midterm elections and encourage European recognition as well. The 1863 Pennsylvania campaign, so the one of Gettysburg, aimed to relieve Virginia of the burden of feeding 2 large armies and to threaten Washington and Philadelphia themselves. Both were facilitated by the famous so-called Lost Order, Special Orders number 191 of 1862 that fell into McClellan's hands, and by Lee's belief that the Northern Copperhead, so the anti-war Democrat sentiment, could be galvanized in the process. As you understand, wars are never easy, principally for political reasons. Both offensives notoriously ended in failure. The first was checked at Antietam on September the 17th, 1862, still the single bloodiest day in American military history, with over 22,000 casualties in roughly 12 hours of fighting. The exact total, so to say, because we can't be fully sure, but the estimate is 22,717. More Americans fell that day than in the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and Mexican War combined. All right. This is where Lee escaped annihilation only because Union Commander George B. Before I mentioned McClellan, who was a West Point graduate of 1846, second in class, brilliant engineer and organizer, also Mexican-American War veteran himself, former president of the Illinois Central Railroad, despite excessive caution. Right, and Antietam also witnessed from the Union side actually greater losses than the Confederates. In any case, it was a strategic defeat for the latter. And the second culminated in the catastrophic three-day evergreen military historical history enthusiast Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July the 1st to the 3rd, 1863, where Lee was forced into a purely offensive fight against well-entrenched Union troops under George G. Meade, West Point graduate in 1835, also him, Mexican-American War veteran, distinguished topographical engineer, cautious but competent, assuming command of the Army of the Potomac only 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg itself. Lee suffered losses from which his army never fully recovered. Gettysburg cost the Army of Northern Virginia approximately 28,000 men, over one-third of its strength. Exact Confederate losses amounted, according to records, to 28,063 individuals. The army never again exceeded 65,000 men and was down to 35,000 by the time of Appomattox, a loss rate it could never replace given the South's shrinking manpower pool that we illustrated before. The Union's gradual shift to total encirclement is the other key here. All right, that's where the Union essentially expressed the best of its political, strategical, and popular dimension and conferred itself a proper direction in the war that, in fact, put together all the needed elements. This stemmed essentially from the political and military genius of Lincoln and Grant. Lee's invasions were not a rejection of the Confederacy's essentially defensive posture, but rather an aggressive expression of the same. Right? There was, as you explained, just so much the Confederacy could do given its resources, and in any case, not relinquishing the offensive to the enemy and actually living off of its parts of its resources was a very sensible strategy. The fastest way to break Northern morale for the end goal was to threaten major cities like Baltimore with its crucial rail connections to Washington, and that, as we've seen politically, had constituted even a violation against at least how the Confederacy had perceived, of course, the federal prerogatives, and to devastate Pennsylvania farmlands instead of remaining passively behind the Confederate border. So we all know, again, how deleterious relinquishing the initiative to the enemy is, especially when you have this overwhelming material disparity at large, right? The more oddly balanced the war is, naturally, the more effective the defensive is, right? However, you also have to always pass to counteroffensive to at least strategically achieve a result. Then politics can suspend everything from a moment to another, but that's another story. Now, initially, the Union's senior commander, General Winfield Scott, that was of Revolutionary era birth, as a matter of fact, veteran of the War of 1812, hero of the Mexican-American War, architect of the decisive Mexico City campaign, general-in-chief since 1841, aged 75 at this point, and physically unable, however, to ride his horse in 1861, had advocated a patient, indirect strategy that the press at that time dubbed famously enough, the Anaconda Plan. The concept called for a slow strangulation of the Confederacy through a tight naval blockade and a simultaneous advance down the Mississippi Valley to essentially split the South in two halves. It actually made a lot of sense given the northern potential, right? And it sort of allowed for really like sort of strategy rather than Schlacht per se, but essentially strangulating and chopping to pieces. Scott's plan also envisioned raising and training a large volunteer army of 300,000 men for 3 years, figures that, because of many reasons in American political culture, seemed fantastical in 1861, but that would actually be surpassed within a year from the beginning of the war. We've seen in other videos about American history how, sort of contrary to much of the inertia of the individual states, like the concept of having a large military force, even just for temporary reasons, would really seem, and how much this could infringe on certain rights of the individual states and more. And of course, like the whole U.S. Civil War was seriously motivated enough to, in fact, surpass all these concerns. But it wouldn't seem, in fact, that possible even before it was actually done, right? We have seen in other videos, by the way, how the Europeans were particularly uninterested in the American Civil War from a doctrinal point of view, because they considered, and they weren't even wrong in this, the Americans as sort of novices of war. They didn't have a large professional officer cadre. They didn't really have an army proper at least in a European comparable sense. And so all what came in the enormous rush of the beginning of the war seemed so amateurish, right, and sort of low key. However, we know that the U.S. Civil War actually opened the path to unprecedented, in fact, levels of military development, broader doctrinal insight, and etc. Now, the Anaconda Plan, was designed to achieve victory with the least possible bloodshed and destruction, in line of principle. It was too much of an economical plan, and it was really detached from the actual course of the much bigger war that fully escalated. In fact, in order to execute the plan, years were estimated as a requirement, and of course the war took sort of not completely different directions because the Anaconda Plan was partly implemented. However, in fact, most modern historians regard the Anaconda Plan itself as the actual blueprint that won the war to the Union. However, as a whole, that was something much more overall military, strategically in particular, detached from the real picture. After Scott's retirement and death, his successor, McClellan, pushed instead for rapid direct strikes towards the Confederate capital at Richmond. This was a much more sort of updated and sensible way to go. It's not like it wasn't ambitious and risky, but at the same time, it had some more straightforward approach. And as you know, great part of this war was attritional. That's also why we pointed out the resources above. Now, McClellan's Peninsula Campaign of 1862, involving the largest amphibious operation in American history until World War II, of 80 years later, ultimately failed outside Richmond during the 7 days battles. These are very interesting food for our video making, right? We will make a lot about the US Civil War. The campaign saw essentially the first combat use of an observation balloon, among various things, by Thaddeus Low's Balloon Corps, as a matter of fact. Also the first ironclad versus ironclad naval engagement, which is a bit of a more interesting thing, the Monitor versus Virginia at Hampton Roads. Frustrated by McClellan's repeated delays, insubordination, and personal insults, even, they really couldn't see each other, Lincoln eventually removed him and appointed Henry W. Halleck, West Point 1839 graduate, third class, renowned military theorist and author of Elements of Military Art and Science, nicknamed Old Brains for this reason, but with no significant field command experience up to that point, as, in fact, general-in-chief as he became. Although Halleck possessed solid theoretical knowledge and began paying greater attention to the Western theater, where Union victories at Forts Henry and Donelson, February 1862, Shiloh, April 1862, the capture of New Orleans, April to May 1862, and Corinth, May 1862, had already begun splitting the Confederacy along the Mississippi, he lacked the drive necessary for decisive action, right, and a more comprehensive strategy, and so also political understanding. Only with the appointment of Ulysses S. Grant, as we were saying before, famously West Point 1843 graduate, you see the years are important, were the same for many of the Mexican-American War veteran, resigned from the army in 1854 amid rumors of drinking. Struggling as a civilian, he had a particularly strikingly failed sort of a business career until 1861. Rose, however, after victories at Fort Donelson, unconditional surrender Grant, that was the nickname that he earned there, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, as general-in-chief finally on March the 12th, 1864. Following his triumphs at the aforementioned Vicksburg, that was fought on July the 4th, fateful day, 1863, capturing 29,500 Confederate soldiers, even though the total number of their surrender was something around 32,000, which is to some extent what the Americans will not see until 1945, effectively completing the opening of the Mississippi. Then you have Chattanooga, November 1863, January 1864, the Cracker Line operation with the Battle of Missionary Ridge. It's only at this point that the Union finally achieved the coordinated multi-theater offensive pressure that turned the war irreversibly in its favor, at least for how it developed. Grant's 1864-65 overland campaign accepted unprecedented casualties, by the way, because the more you push and the more that happens, also because, of course, the Confederates are defending. We're talking about over 60,000 casualties in 6 weeks. But he was inflicting irreplaceable losses on the Confederates at a 2-to-1 ratio while never retreating. So this has, in relative terms, a decisive psychological impact, and it was a strategic turning point, grinding down Lee's army at a ratio that Confederacy, as we've seen, could not sustain. Right, so that is the most important aspect. It's a cascade effect that at that point really works also at a scale of strategic operation that the Confederacy can only dream, right? And that is more importantly sees that can never achieve during a lost war. In the Western Theater, Grant's principal opponent had been Albert Sidney Johnston, West Point graduate 1826, 8th in class veteran of the Texas War of Independence, and the Mexican one, considered the Confederacy's finest soldier until he was mortally wounded at Shiloh. Then you have later PGT Beauregard, West Point 1838, graduate 2nd in class, hero of Fort Sumter, flamboyant but inconsistent to an extent. Finally, Braxton Bragg, West Point 1837, Mexican War artillery hero, notoriously quarrelsome and strategically rigid. We will see all these personalities better at some other point. The Battle of Antietam in September 1862 had stopped Lee's first invasion, as we've seen, But McClellan's army sustained higher casualties and allowed the Confederates to retreat safely into Virginia. Lincoln nonetheless sacked McClellan, as we've seen, who later opposed him, in fact, in the 1864 election on a peace platform, even. Tactically, a draw, Antietam became a strategic Union victory because Lee withdrew first and abandoned his invasion. This limited but vital success, in a way, gave Lincoln the political opening he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Although the proclamation technically freed only the 3.5 million slaves living in the rebellious state, so out of the Union control, it set in motion the legal process that would eventually liberate every person still held in bondage across the United States. It also authorized the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army. By the war's end, nearly 180,000 African American troops, the United States colored troops, had served, comprising roughly 10% of the Union Army. The official count, the USCT as they're called, enlisted is 178,975 plus 20,000 black sailors. As a matter of fact, they fought in 450 engagements and suffered 35% higher death rates and earning 25 medals of honor. Equally important, it ensured that Britain and France, both officially opposed to slavery and having already abolished it in their own empires, at least formally, would never grant diplomatic recognition or material support to the Confederacy, because with the proclamation, the North essentially aligned itself with the policy of the more, at least the leading Western sort of advanced powers, and the most militarily powerful one, by the way. As you know, Britain was mostly flirting with the South at that point, had been doing that. And naturally, there were lots of European observers, right? And this political move set very interesting amount of international consequences in stage. The proclamation turned the war into also a moral crusade from an ideological, propagandistic point of view. It also made European intervention politically impossible as such. The Trent Affair of late 1861 had already shown how close Anglo-American relations had come to war. The proclamation removed any remaining moral pretext for intervention. The Union naval blockade, despite enormous effort, never became fully effective. At its peak, it involved over 500 vessels, 671 ships, and 75 ironclads by 1865. Briefly, the world's largest navy as a consequence, even though it was not, in fact, to remain that in order to be maintained properly as the war ended, and reduced Confederate foreign trade by roughly 2/3. Yet blockade runners still managed to deliver critical supplies, notoriously, especially from Nassau and Bermuda, throughout the World War. Right, the runner to blockader success ratio remained about 1 in 3 until the final months of the war, at least. By early 1865, the blockade was 95% effective and captured/destroyed 1,500 runners. Since the Confederacy was overwhelmingly agricultural, pointed out before, and it's notorious, the shortages that developed affected mostly luxury goods and therefore hurt the planter elite far more than ordinary Southerners, at least in an absolute fashion. Domestic Confederate arms production also quickly offset the loss of imported weapons. There was a lot of autarkic sort of way of doing in the South. The Confederacy's Ordnance Bureau under Josiah Gorgas, West Point, 1841 graduate, one of the few northern-born officers to join the South, performed miracles at that point, producing or salvaging over 600 pieces of artillery and hundreds of thousands of rifles. This was really a marvel and a shared also American feat that the Confederacy, however, owned. Yet, chronic shortages of nitrates for gunpowder forced the use of, for example, things like urine collection programs and the importation of saltpeter from caves and abroad, or just very few places in the world that produce most of sulfur, for example, as well. And in reality, the South inflicted far greater economic damage on itself through its self-imposed cotton embargo. Before the war, cotton had been the region's economic lifeblood, for obvious reasons. By the late 1850s, American cotton supplied 77% of British and 90% of French consumption as well. Hence, also the aforementioned connections with those, but the North had. But this was important enough for the global markets. Hoping to coerce London and Paris into diplomatic recognition and perhaps even military intervention, the Confederate government banned cotton exports at the end of 1861. So they basically gambled in this, say we let the Brits and the Frenchies without our cotton, so they will essentially help us to, at least to gain something in the process. Maybe they're going to intervene, who knows. But famously enough, the gamble failed completely. And this was very self-destructive. It's understandable, and if anything, we will talk more about this economic policy. But despite also lobbying from textile manufacturers, both European powers, Britain and France, chose neutrality rather than risk war with the United States as a whole, because this war was also to end. Any possible intervention, again, it's all a what if, but it would have been a huge deal, as a matter of fact. A very different era from the one of, in fact, just the sporty aristocratic way of going out. This was the age of mass society already, and it was a much bigger deal. It had to be already a big deal at the time of the 18th century. We can't imagine now. Now, by the time the fighting ended in America, Egypt, India, and Brazil had permanently replaced southern cotton on the world market. A development that would cripple the post-war southern economy for decades further, because they had essentially let other markets take advantage of that absence. This also shows a bit the desperation, because, again, the South did really recognize the disparity with the North, and so they really gambled as high as they could in relation with that. The embargo slashed exports from 4.5 million bales in 1860 to under 10,000 in 1862. It was a self-inflicted annual loss of $300 to $400 million that historians called the Confederacy's worst strategic blunder. So when you look at the World War, you realize how, in many ways, the U.S. Civil War is pretty straightforward. But at the same time, it's also understanding how big of a system this actually was, and how not to be given for granted Union victory, nor in fact the broader, the same length of the war, by the way, we could think of, and the losses, as you know, the war were disconcertingly high, showing that these two systems had really gone at one another with an immense motivation, with an immense level of, regardless of, again, of the initial. This is very interesting also when you look at military history, like how wars that nobody really even thought could be fought, especially at that scale, eventually, in fact, escalate to that level due to the immediate strategic constraints at the same time. In 2022, we would have said that, the Russians would have injected so many men for, the last, in Pokrovsk, you have literally 50 meters that cost 1,200 Russian soldiers. 50 meters. Right? And these are things that, tell actually a lot from a political, from a historical, from a broader moral point of view, meaning, how desperate can you be, right, to do this? And the history of the U.S. Civil War, as much of as any topic that we study on Schwerpunkt, is exactly aimed at telling us this rather than about warfare itself. Like some channels who tell you, look, oh no, you don't have to study the military history alone because it's actually just socio-economical. It's just, you have to understand the structure. You have to understand the you must study military history in its purely, exquisitely strategic, also political, of course, but in this sense also a dimensional, operational dimension, even a tactical one, of course, because if you don't do that, you essentially don't understand how or why the systems work. The systems do not work because somebody else made them work or they go on by themselves. These are people making them go. And yes, it can be naturally very demanding to make them function in many ways, but at the same time, things will go in different ways from the one you expected, to say the least. But the struggle is always between two active parties that also mutually interfere with one another. And here, of course, we're seeing even more the civil war between Americans. You can argue that, I don't know what the Texans have to do with people from Maine, or there is something to that, and surely they have something to do with one another, not just as Americans, but also at other broader civilizational levels. And so that's why this war is so fascinating, and we must definitely talk more and more about this. You understand these are tiny bits packed with a lot of specific information. At times it may be, even superfluous if you know very well the history of the U.S. Civil War. But this is at least our third episode. Again, I don't remember how many more we're going to do before entering the actual specifics of everything. Again, I think it's very useful because I must confess one of my greatest ambitions historically, especially in my mid-20s, was to learn very well not just American military history, but American history. And this is a great occasion, so to say, to exploit the chance that the channel offers. So far, we talked specifically about, aside from pastly, we talked about the Anaconda Plan in the video about the U.S. Army between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. And so we are from 1815 to 1861. It's a couple of generations. Then we made a video about properly the U.S. Civil War proper, the causes of the Civil War, the beginning of the hostilities. So it's really a very introductory and sort of broader, more broadly sort of conceptual video. Then we talked in another one about the junior officers, militias, so properly the military sister organization, Shiloh, as well as a battle. The European views, as we were hinting at before, on American military amateurism, as it was really seen. And I must say that how many views did they get? Probably not many, and I don't know how or why, but maybe also over time. Because this is the playlist. Wait a second. U.S. Civil. Well, the causes of the U.S. Civil War actually got last year lots of views, 1,600 compared to the more recent one, only 600. So I don't know. Last spring I made this year we made especially the series we have to finish about the Crimean War, and we have a 19th century history playlist that is not entirely about warfare, that counts, as we see here, 29 videos. This is the 30th. Mostly, at least, we began with Napoleonic stuff. There's a bit of Ukrainian history. More recently, we looked a bit more at actually 19th century stuff. We really, however, lack the most robust foundation for this century. it's the one we covered the least, I think, except, well, the 21st, but in relative terms, it's also because less happened. And actually have a series, at least a playlist. No, not yet, but we talk about 20th century warfare. 20th century, we actually made 46 videos already. And the playlist even received a fairly consistent amount of views in comparison, considering the novelty as a whole. And it's been a mixed bag. Some videos have been particularly watched, others, man, not so much. I was shocked to see the Pontefract Midway, the British raid on Taranto, also the recent video about the Hungarian Revolution. They got disconcertingly low amount of views at this compared to the other videos, which was weird because also last year, for example, we made the video about the gold. People sort of watched it. It was a 2 hours long one. Oddly enough. And also about the 18th century, especially recently, made something more consistent. We're also expanding on that. 35 videos only, but still pretty dense, especially from a military point of view, from a doctrinal standpoint. There is really a lot in that series. So I saw also in here not a huge amount of views. I was actually impressed a little bit by this scarcity of views. At least the Prussian stuff got more views or something. Well, okay, also Vauban. Some things got more views, others so. And then about the 17th century, we start having really a lot since the beginning of Schwerpunkt. So there's these. We should make more about the 16th century. I have everything counting here. It's 17th, it's almost 100 videos. So I plan especially to look at the Age of Revolutions, this stuff, because the Napoleonic era, I'll be blunt about this, just to explain you part of my policy. Also, we have to make an update about Ukraine, because I usually do it every couple of months. And the interesting aspect here is, we'll be covering things probably soon, with a good video on Ukraine. The point I was saying is that I'm not making a lot of contemporary warfare videos because of Russia. Honestly, you would say, but how, Schwerpunkt, you're unbiased, you're objective, you have your method. You don't make videos because you have to talk about Russia. I also made videos about Russia, also in the Middle Ages. I talk about Ruthenia as well. The problem is that it seems to me that if I make videos about Russia, it doesn't matter how or why. Like, I could make a video about the Battle of Stalingrad. I could make, that's the Soviet Union, you could argue, but it's not an excuse. There are very interesting topics, telling the truth, about that. For example, I studied in my day Machno Revolt. We made videos about the Polish Bolshevik Wars. Yes, I uploaded something about Varna, or some of the same Crimean War. It is Russian warfare because they lost, and in this sense, I follow a bit like a mix of informative stuff, but also showing the defiance of Russia. Definitely never had it particularly easy in history for some reason. And that sort of leaves me a bit perplexed, because I know that it doesn't matter what I do. If I make some videos about Russia, Russian warfare, it's always going to be seen as some kind of propagandistic move, right? So it may be strange, because obviously I wouldn't make the videos like that, in that form, but for some reason I decided to avoid talking about it entirely, because of victories, defeats. There is, at this point in history, I don't think, not a great need to concentrate over that. And I understand the reason, and I have also personal reasons for this that are non-obvious. It's not like I say, well, you support Ukraine, so you don't make it. That's not the point. There are actually deeper reasons, partly personal. partly they have to do with the channel itself, right? It's not like I fear to be, to get enemies, or to fear that I'm scared to talk about. I could make a video about Stalingrad tomorrow, as a matter of fact. Again, I must be very, very clear about this. And it's not like I don't want to cover specifically Russian victories as such, but there are some reasons I can't do this now, that I can't simply explain to you. But at the same time, I think that I will open a little bit more on this, especially as we continue our series about Ukraine, because we need these terms of comparison. I mean, you can't tell, of course, Napoleonic history without Russian warfare. You can't talk about World War One the way you should. So it's really complicated. There are many different topics I could use just to show. I'm thinking about Bandera, Mannerheim. Like, there are so many different interesting standpoints. The same Russian Civil War. Like, there's plenty. That's actually an idea. I could make some videos about that. However, in the moment, I followed from literally since the war began this kind of pattern, and also in the more recent years, I had additional reasons not to follow that specific trend. But 19th century history requires an enormous deal of this. And in fact, the same revolutionary movements can't help. So talking about, for example, Poland, the November uprising, those are very cool, also from a military point of view, even though they're sort of very different. Also, it's not just about the Russians. As you know, von Clausewitz died during one of these wars. And but the 19th century, we lack so far a consistent bulk of property of videos on them, and I am working to replenish this soon with something consistent. But 19th century history is not just very interesting. Again, I had the US Civil War series at hand. I exploited this, but it's also something actually very violent and brutal. Many people think that the 19th century at large was, I don't know, more peaceful in Europe or something. It's actually not the case at all, right? It was one of the most violent, brutal centuries out there, and looking at, in fact, different policies along that pattern, I think is very interesting and very revealing too, right? So there are lots of things I don't explain the way I decide which topic to cover or not, but I hope at some point we can talk about this. I also have to make the autumn update. Well, let's get to 30,000, shall we? The views went up in October. Admittedly, I made lots of videos that sort of helped in that regard, and we're still fairly high, especially in income, especially in views, and still, like, we're not in a bad phase for the channel, but we should grow a little bit more. This year we came back growing, especially in the last couple of months, from moments that, let's say, did not witness this enormous level of reach. But at the same time, we have to understand that the channel I get, this is the thing I always tell you. I always get people to say, oh my God, for so many years, I didn't know you even existed. Where have you been all this time? I needed to watch you, right? So this stuff must be shared. When I say that we must share, it's not merely, a matter of convenience or whatever. It is literally, there is a reason why this content matters and people want to see it, right? So time passes and things happen, but let's say the whole meaning of this platform is, in a sense, exposing people as much as possible to the content. And without this mechanism, it's a bit difficult to really look at what is concretely going on. We've reached 2.6 million views, which is not that bad, especially they have been escalating in the last couple of years. But this doesn't mean that we can't do more and better. And especially we have to break properly we have to go literally through the roof, right? We can't afford anymore to just be passively looking at this rhythm of views. And lots of people keep coming here. There is no doubt that it's all very, people do follow, people do care. But especially, again, the most straightforward ways to really share this is also creating issues, right? If you go on other channels and you say, but there's Schwerpunkt that says that, it provoked them, right? And big channels that have just published a video in an hour or so, like, well, Schwerpunkt talked about this too. Why don't you talk with Schwerpunkt about it? I don't want to talk with them, of course. But there is this sort of weird mechanism, this weird mobbing that actually does get things done, right? And naturally the channel has the means to grow by itself, but it doesn't seem like there is a generalized awareness of what we talk about here, why. And this has always been our issue. I was quite patient for years. I went on for, I think it was 3 years without 3 years without monetizing. Then YouTube began to monetize in my stead, so I monetized as well. I didn't share a great deal. Then we started sharing, we got more views. So it turns out that you have to seek for this stuff. I make the videos, and of course, like, it takes some time to do so. I also I have a site. I don't know if you know that. I added the link. It was finally indexed by Google after like 1 year or so. But there are lots of keywords for anything historical, and I realized from the analytics that for some reason ChatGPT redirects many people, a consistent amount of people, to my content. I don't know whether it's through the site, but since I add the description to every single video that I make, etc., like, it's there are lots of words at this point. I don't know how many videos I inserted, maybe, I don't know, some tens. If we go on with that, it's going to reach like very interesting result, and let's hope naturally that everything goes the way it must at this point. More than this, I can't see a way to publicize the channel. Any paid ads is really scammy. Like, I get so many views for free. Just without that, I don't need what I have to pay for a fraction of that, essentially what I earn from YouTube itself. So again, you are, I must tell you this, you're actually a great community. I don't say it just because you are my own. And there are some people who really do something extraordinary. Leaving aside, which is actually extraordinary as well, the donations that I was very surprised by ever since I installed the thing. I have here, I think 26, 28, how many? It fluctuates because it's never quite the same. Some upload, subscribe and get membership, don't, because it's not fixed, right? But then also on Patreon, I started that as well. So that's great. But even probably as people, I realize that you're very cool. Like, in general, you're always here. You listen to it, to the whole thing. You spend a great time watching. Like, I feel really, like, I wonder even how possible this is, meaning that I would probably never listen to myself. But at the same time, I hope, of course, that the topics I discuss are relevant, right? And that's why I care also for you to see where I come from with this, because it is true that I made so many videos, but as you've just seen, it's not like I have covered everything, and unfortunately so, because at least basically I should have covered everything by now had I followed the principle of just let's uniformly cover the basics, a bit of all aspects. It's not been the case. But at the same time, it's been interesting. We've really discussed lots of things, and also some, as a consequence, better than others. And we are at a point where we can further expand, and I really believe the channel has a a bright future, as we are not losing time. We are really working on it. Like if we work that minimal extra, that the channel can basically feed itself by itself, because it's going to hide. It already is the case. Like the channel is very sort of mature at this point. Well, everything will be easier for everybody. Also for you. You would say, but how? Schwerpunkt, how? Just going to see, because you will interact with it anymore. If you see that I have more views, if I see that people debate, you will intervene, you will study the channel further. It's a completely different experience from the past years where I was practically unknown, and you were just some of the few that decided to spend time, I don't know, in this gloomy autumn days to listening to my work as a sort of it's always remaining this way, personal. It's always going to remain me sort of discussing this way. It's part of the reason also why I probably don't get more views. But I don't care, because the channel has this very specific philosophy, and it looks at things that are equally relevant in historical perspective. So we have really a lot to do in this regard. There are so many different cool topics to cover. I'm very thankful that we could do this together, and I'm sure that there is really a lot ahead that we are going to achieve. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.